Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to what should be the post-summit briefing, but the summit is still going on, so let us call it the live update summit briefing, and also our regular EPC update session. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, delighted to welcome Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies, and Fabian Zuleeg, the Chief Executive. And in this special edition of Update, we're going to be discussing the EU's next steps against Putin's war of aggression, focusing on the summit I just mentioned, which is just, we hope, on the verge of ending, but they are still discussing the contentious issue of energy at the moment. And it's part of a remarkable trilogy of meetings that took place in Brussels yesterday and then continuing into today, of NATO, of the G7, and then of the EU 27 with Joe Biden in attendance. Before we get underway, as always, totally interactive conversation. I'm going to ask Fabian and Janis a few questions, but very happy to hear your questions as well. You can either put them in the Q&A box in writing briefly, please, or click on the raise hands button and I will activate your mic and allow you to talk when the time comes. So let us crack straight on because we have a lot of ground to discover. And Janis, you've been tracking developments at the summit, as I say, not over yet, but what were they due to discuss? And just so that I get a sense of how all these meetings fit together, to what extent did the agenda of the EU summit dovetail with the agenda of the NATO meeting and the G7 meeting?
But I think that what connects all of them is this attempt and also the ability to show a high degree of unity. It was about showing that everyone who is in those three organizations, and there are a lot of overlaps as we know, agree on how one needs to deal with the war of aggression of Putin, now more than a month into it. So this is what combines them. Obviously, they have different roles to play. NATO took a decision to deploy more military to the eastern flank of the alliance, which is a strong sign not only of unity, but obviously also a strong sign towards Putin, the leadership in Moscow, that NATO is committed to making sure that if there are any form of attacks or intrusions in the alliance, that they will be defending each other. So this was the strong sign, also indicating that, and that I think was a strong message coming from the NATO summit, that in case chemical weapons or biological weapons might be used, that this would create a totally different ballgame, and that NATO would then might get or would get stronger involved than they have been up till now. So I think that was the strong signal coming from there. The G7, I think, was an addition showing that also Japan and Canada are on board, but nothing much came out of that at the end of the day. And then we had the EU summit, which started yesterday with Biden attending it, also Zelensky then joining it after Biden had left. So all this was about showing a strong signal of unity, showing to the own audiences, but also especially to Moscow, that one is committed to supporting Ukraine, to helping Ukraine to make sure that the war of aggression will not be won by President Putin.
And as you say, a display of unity across the West, EU, US, and so on. But Fabian, that display of unity cracking somewhat overnight as the EU gets into discussing some of the most difficult issues it faces. We'll come to the detail of it in a moment, all relating to energy above all else, but also a lot of discussion on sanctions and various issues. We discussed at our last update after the Versailles informal summit, really the remarkable unity that the EU had shown in its initial response to the war. Do you believe that fundamentally, despite some difficult issues to address, that unity is holding, or are we beginning to see cracks in it?
I think firstly, we are still seeing the unity. I mean, that we are having differences, that was to be expected, especially as we are getting into some very difficult territory, which affects these countries also profoundly at home. So this is no longer just about providing support to Ukraine. It is about the consequences of that at home. So there will be differences. The question is, do they come together in the end? And for the moment, at least, I think the pressure is still there to come up with a unified position in the end. I don't think it is possible for them to come out of this summit saying publicly that they couldn't get to an agreement. But the other question then is, given those differences, how decisive can the decisions be which are taken? And this, I think, is the big question now, not only when it comes to the measures which need to be taken in the short term, which have to do with how do we deal, firstly, with the continuation of the war in Ukraine and how we support Ukraine, but also with the consequences, especially energy and economic consequences. And of course, they're linked through the sanctions or through a possible boycott of oil and gas. And then we have to start already thinking about what is the long-term consequence of that. Again, for Ukraine, and this is why we are now having a discussion around some form of reconstruction fund, a commitment to rebuild Ukraine after this. But we also need to think about what does this mean for the European Union? What does that mean for all the different policy areas? Because, and this is coming back to what we've said from the beginning, this being a watershed moment, it will have an impact on everything. And that is something which will also be hard to manage politically.
And you said that point about why it's becoming more difficult, because, as you say, it affects countries profoundly at home. Alexander De Croo, the Belgian Prime Minister, said in the discussion on sanctions, we must be sure that the sanctions affect Russia more than they affect us. We're not declaring war on ourselves here. So, as you say, as we get into the nitty-gritty, Janis, it does get more difficult because countries are affected in different ways. Do you feel that the unity is holding, let's put it this way, as well as can be expected? Or are you concerned that perhaps, Fabian just said they can't come out and say they couldn't agree at all? Are you concerned that the gravity of this moment, the seriousness of this moment, the watershed nature of where we are, perhaps is receding a bit? They were very aware of it in Versailles. Are they a little less aware of it now, do you think?
No, I think that they're aware of it. And I think there is a high degree of fundamental unity when it comes to the fact of making sure that when a signal, sending the right signal and doing the right things with respect to what is happening in Ukraine. And by the way, if you hear and followed what Zelensky was telling them, he was telling them, thank you, but we need more. And I think that is now the big message, which is, yes, there has been a high degree of unity. It was faster than we have seen unity emerge in the past and also firmer. But this is no time for self-congratulating oneself. It is about doing more. And I think when it comes to doing more, there's the aspect of what now needs to be done. And there are discussions with respect, for example, to what you were referring to, the sanctions, the energy sanctions, where you have clear differences between member states. Some pushing very hard, including the Polish, the Baltics, who say that we need energy sanctions, that we need strong energy sanctions, and other countries, especially those who are heavily dependent on energy coming from Russia, who are not thinking in that direction. They want to gain time. They want to find a way of being able to find new sources of energy, especially when it comes to gas, but also with respect to oil and coal. When it comes to enlargement, there are differences, and I think we're going to go through some of these differences as we discuss. So there are differences with respect to what to do now, but also what to do in the long term. And my impression is that there are a good number of leaders, also a good number of member states, and also a good number of experts who have not yet understood the gravity of the moment. Because if this is a watershed moment, as Fabian was saying, if this is a new era, if this is a Zeitenwende, as Scholz called it, there are things which have to be radically changed. And when it comes to radical change, I think that we are not thinking big enough, that we're still having this old thinking in mind. There are some who hope that in a couple of weeks, couple of months' time, we will be able to go back to some form of normal. And that's an illusion. And here I think that we are not going individually and collectively far enough.
One other question relating to the sort of the overall mood music, Fabian, and that relates to Joe Biden, here, of course, for the NATO summit and the G7, and then invited by EU leaders to join them last night at the summit. what can we say about the state of the Western alliance at this stage, 1 month into the war? And what do you think, or is it too early to read into this, the longer term implications for the EU in relation to how dependent or not it is on the US? The link here, of course, with the China dimension, they did briefly discuss the upcoming summit. How do you see, what was the mood music looked very good from the Biden visit? Was the behind the scenes music equally good, do you think?
Yes, I think it was. But just before I come to that, just one word on economic sanctions. I think it is important to recognize that, of course, economic sanctions hurt both sides. And if they are vital to Russian interests, they will hurt us as well. But we also have the capacity to cushion a lot of that impact. So this is not about having the same impact here as it would have in Russia. Russia is now economically very weak. It is struggling in many areas. So it can be no question that the impact of these kind of sanctions are much worse on Russia than they are here. And in the end, we shouldn't forget that what really is important here is what impact this has relatively on Ukraine. Because in the end, it is about making sure that Ukraine gets whatever support it can, and that also means affecting the capacity of Putin to continue this war. But on Biden, yes, I think what we have seen is a revival of the transatlantic alliance. Certainly, NATO is no longer brain dead, as some people have said before. The signaling was very strong, and that also was including the commitment militarily to signal very clearly to Moscow that an attack on any NATO country would be considered to be the defensive case for all of them. And putting troops into the eastern flank is a very clear signal, because any attack then on those countries is a direct attack on the armed forces of some of the NATO members. So it does make it very clear that there would be a consequence if Putin tried that. I think what we've also seen is much better coordination between the US and the European countries. There has been a continuous exchange, also a continuous attempt of coordinating the actions, making sure that the economic sanctions work in unison. So it is very much a revival. What that means in the long term, I think it's too early to say. Certainly, I don't think it removes the need for Europeans to take their hard security much more seriously and to shoulder more of the burden. That would be the case whoever is going to be in the White House. But there is still this question about whether if we had a different president, the previous president in the White House, whether we would have anything like this kind of unity between the
It was quite striking that when Joe Biden was still urging countries to do more, spend more on defense, he did say, but I'm not the former guy. I'm not the other guy. I'm different. I am making this plea to you, but with a different spirit. I have to ask you, Fabian, and very briefly, there was a picture doing the rounds overnight of the British Prime Minister at a photo opportunity, one of the family photographs, can't remember which of them, many summits yesterday it was, looking rather awkward while everyone was slapping each other on the back and shaking hands behind him. Now, I mean, I think these pictures, you can always find the moment where one leader is standing and nobody is talking to them. But nevertheless, in the wake of the comments that he made last weekend about comparing Brexiteers to UK freedom fighters, was that really why he was not invited along with Joe Biden to join the EU27? Has it caused real anger? You said it's a revival of the transatlantic alliance, but it looked as if the UK and EU were working well on these issues, but over the last few days, that seems to have fractured. Or is this a bit overplayed?
I think the picture itself is, in a sense, a nice meme people can adopt, because it shows something in a picture, which I think a lot of people have perceived to be the case. I think there is some truth behind that. The remarks which Boris Johnson made, and then doubled down on. It's not only that he made those remarks, and they were not off-the-cuff remarks. They were made very deliberately in a speech which was scripted beforehand. And to make this comparison between Brexit and the fight for freedom by Ukrainians is deeply offensive. It is deeply offensive to Europeans, but it is, of course, also deeply offensive to Ukrainians. And I think some of the reactions have clearly shown that. I don't think that leads to a situation where there will not be an attempt to continue the cooperation, because it is important that the UK is on board and that it is clear that, for example, when it comes to economic sanctions, when it comes to military action, that the UK is involved. But it does reinforce also the perception, which I think is accurate, of people that Boris Johnson is not a trustworthy leader they can work with, and that there is always this scoring domestic political points, which seems to be more important to Boris Johnson than any cooperation, any real issues which are on the table. Well, and that, I think, is going to make cooperation very difficult.
Absolutely, and quite striking that the British side said that Boris had discussed the Northern Ireland Protocol with Ursula von der Leyen yesterday. The EU side didn't say that it had been discussed, but you do wonder at the wisdom of raising an issue like that at a summit that's so important at such a difficult time, but that we'll leave aside for now. Janis, let me come and link Joe Biden to the discussion on energy. Two elements to this discussion. One on energy imports and the phase out, and we've heard word from Germany about doing it faster or aiming to do it faster than we thought. There was this deal between the EU and the US for more LNG to be supplied. Was there, I mean, do you detect a movement in this discussion on energy imports, or is this really, above all else, we'll come to the other issues in a moment, above all else, the area where it affects countries so profoundly differently that actually it's impossible really for the EU to come to a common position that says, okay, we have to do this, we have to ban imports or whatever, that we can't get there because some countries just can't do it?
Yeah, let me start by making one reference to the US and to the interdependence between the EU, its member states, and the US, which is becoming very clear now. It's becoming very clear in the context of NATO. If you watched the summit yesterday, you could clearly see how significant the role of the US is and how much Europeans are dependent also on making sure that the US is committed, also having in mind what the situation was with the previous administration, obviously. So there is a strong dependence on the US, and it's becoming now even stronger if you look into the energy sector, where the need for liquid, for LNG requires us to have a strong energy cooperation with the US. But having said that, we should also have in mind how significant it is that the Europeans, that the European Union is reacting so forcefully against the war of aggression of Putin. Because we all know that at the end of the day, what everyone wants to avoid is a direct military confrontation. So what we're now seeing is an economic war. And here the US on its own would not be strong enough. It needs Europeans. And they, in many ways, were not sure that Europeans would react so firmly, so strongly in economic terms with respect to sanctions and potentially also to do other things in future, that they are very much cooperating with the Europeans, but they also knew Washington needs to have the support of the EU, and also Biden needs it, because at home he's under pressure to also show a strong position vis-a-vis Russia. Now, having said that, with respect to energy sanctions, I think that, yes, this is something which is strongly dividing member states. By the way, also in those member states, look, for example, Germany with its heavy dependence and also its particular strong economic role in the EU, you have an internal national debate about how to deal with sanctions. And you saw yesterday, for example, a letter being co-signed by a whole lot of influential people in Germany arguing we need to go further when it comes to energy sanctions. We need to impose sanctions, stronger ones, and more quickly than we think, that this is a strategic imperative. So there is also a movement in the German debate, besides all the efforts to become more independent from Russian energy,
might we see a differentiated approach, that countries that can go further than the ones that are so reliant on Russian energy that for now they can't? Is that possible? And if it was, would it work? I mean, would it hold, or would people say no because we're taking all the pain and you're not? So I mean, is it possible to come up with something that takes account of these differences of dependency?
Yes. Well, two things. First of all, I think that we are now 1 month into this war. In a month's time, 2 months' time, the situation might have changed. Also, public opinion in the countries which now are very worried about strong energy sanctions, might also push governments in a different direction. So the situation of today might look different in a month's time. Secondly, yes, there is a lot of discussions on energy sanctions, which is black and white, is binary. It's about cutting off from Russian energy now or not doing it. And there is a lot of in-between options which are out there. You mentioned differentiated sanctions, and that you have different countries in the EU dealing with sanctions, energy sanctions differently, but in accordance with others in the group. And there's also a discussion about concentrating on oil and on coal, and not starting with gas, at least not at the beginning. There are discussions happening with respect to having an escrow account, so that money would be paid, but it would be on a separate account. So you have different forms of potential energy sanctions you can impose. So the discussion should not be as binary as it currently is. But now you still have strong opposition in Italy, in Germany, also in Hungary, by the way, also for political reasons there, against energy sanctions. But the pressure is increasing, and we might be finding ourselves in a situation where the pressure on these governments will increase enormously also at home.
Thank you. Fabian, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just 2 points. I think it's important also to always bear in mind that Russia can still use this as a weapon. And we should be very careful about the kind of signal we are also giving to Moscow. If we are saying to Moscow that we cannot live without this oil and gas at this moment, that invites Russia to actually use it as a weapon. So I think we should be very careful and signal that, yes, there is a way we can deal with this situation. We can already take a number of steps, as Janis was saying. It doesn't necessarily mean we have a full boycott. There's a big difference, for example, between oil and gas, and we can talk about how we deal with those separately. But I think we should also make it clear that if necessary, it can be done, because otherwise we're giving Putin far too much of a weapon which he could use. The other point I think is of course, that any kind of boycott has a very differentiated impact, which is why we have to talk about solidarity. We have to talk about how we cushion the effect of any of this on those countries which are most vulnerable. And that means countries within the European Union, but also countries outside the European Union, in particular also affected not just by energy, but also by food prices, which is going to be a major challenge for a number of countries. So we have to talk about effective solidarity now. And yes, that is going to cost money. But I think we always have to go back to what we started this conversation with, that this is a historical watershed moment. And you are in a war with a country which at this moment in time is trying to destroy liberal democracy. So we have to take the measures which are necessary to counter that.
Fabian, sorry, Janis, can you bring us up to speed on what is dividing EU leaders at the moment from what we know? Obviously, they're in a room, we're not in there with them, but it's the other side of the energy equation. And Fabian also just mentioned their food prices. Let's focus on that so far, but on the already soaring cost of energy, never mind what would happen if you did go down the road of energy sanctions. What are they arguing about? What are the disagreements? And do they agree on any aspects of this?
Well, first of all, we were saying that day one of the EU summit was a strong sign of unity, and today they struggle. And they struggle because they are having a discussion, and this discussion is not new. We're seeing it since at least September of last year. We've seen it at various summits about how to deal with the increasing energy prices. And if you remember, in September, there were some who were arguing, well, in some months' time, we will see that the situation will become more normal, that it will stabilize, that it's not as bad as it seems. Well, obviously that has gone up in flames because the situation has deteriorated. So all those, especially led by the Spanish government, but also supported by Italy and others, who argue that we need market intervention, that we need to think about capping prices, especially when it comes to gas. And we know that that it's a very complicated market, the energy market, and there is a distortion in the market because of the high gas prices, which is also affecting electricity prices. So they are arguing we need to think about capping pricing. We need to intervene into the market, and others are saying we should not intervene, especially the Dutch and the Germans argue in this direction, but not only them, but they're the ones who are leading the group, who say we should not be moving in this direction because this would be sending the wrong signal, because now we need more energy supplies from outside Europe, and if we would cap prices, that would make us as a market not attractive. They would be selling their energy elsewhere. And also that it could have a long-term negative effect if we now intervene into the markets. So you have these two schools of thoughts, and this is exactly, these schools of thoughts are now clashing with each other more clearly than they have done at previous summits. They cannot agree. The summit should have ended at 2 o'clock. It's now almost 4. They had a break, they reconvened, so they're still discussing. There is, it seems, an agreement when it comes to energy acquisition, joint energy acquisition, with the Commission playing a stronger role, and is thinking about the vaccines in mind from the past. Also, when it comes to storage, there is seems to be an agreement. When it comes to capping of prices and intervention in the market, there is still disagreement. I have to see whether they will come out with a compromise, or at least a compromise in wording, because what we've seen at this over the past weeks is, because of the pressure of unity, there often are compromise in terms of conclusions on paper, but in real terms, there are the differences still remain. So we need to see what kind of progress there will be, but it's still ongoing.
Absolutely. And Fabian, I mean, we see some very tough language from Spain, Janis mentioned, from the Poles, those countries that believe very strongly that we do need to see interventions in the market. How do you think this will play out eventually? And what would the implications be if they do directly intervene in the sorts of ways that Spain and others are calling for?
I think in the end, they will have to find a compromise. And this is very difficult in a situation where you have these strong demands on the table of taking direct action. I think we are going to see some form of compromise emerging. But I think what Janis and I have already said is that this is a moving target. I mean, this is not a final word which is going to be said today on what to do. If anything, it's an interim step for a much more in-depth discussion. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the longer term discussion, which also has to be there already, which is that regardless of what happens in the short term, Europe will have to get to a decoupling from Russian oil and gas. So we will have to get into a situation where we meet our energy needs differently than we have done up to now. And that will also have implications for investment, for costs, for market intervention, for contingency mechanisms which we have to put into place, how we connect with each other, how we connect with the rest of the world. I mean, we already have now the commitment, for example, from the US to provide LNG at a scale which we haven't seen before. So this is the kind of thing where we will have to continue to have action over the coming months.
Absolutely. And on the other side of that, there is a commentary that's been published by the EPC this week, written by Federico Molle and George Oricles, saying Europe must prepare for a wartime economy is the title. And it looks not just at rising energy costs, but also this other issue that I mentioned, that of food prices. We're seeing that begin to come to the fore now, but there's been a lot less focus so far. Fabian, would you expect the EU to act in this area? And because of the common agricultural policy, does it have more levers that it can pull? And then just to remind everyone, if you do have a question, please don't hesitate to write it in the Q&A box or raise your hand. But Fabian, on food prices, would you expect some EU action? Not now, but quite soon down the road?
Acting on food prices is generally very difficult because there are so many things which go into food. So how do you then choose what you act on? It's very, very difficult to do. And also we have a very regulated market. But in the end, I think we shouldn't forget that while there might be an effect, and certainly rising prices always are also politically difficult. But when it comes to food, the European Union is not the most affected. We do have a high degree of food security. And while we might have some shortages in certain areas, overall, these can be compensated within the European Union. I think here we really have to put our efforts into seeing what happens in other countries, in our neighboring countries. And that's not just because humanitarian, from a humanitarian perspective, it's the right thing to do, but it's also in our enlightened self-interest. If we don't do this, for example, we will have new waves of migration of people who no longer can feed themselves in North Africa and other places. If we don't do this, we will have the problems which are going to come in terms of maintaining this almost global alliance against Putin. I mean, we have seen over 140 countries voting against this invasion. But if we actually have famines, if we have these negative impacts in countries, then we will lose that support. We will lose the legitimacy of what we are doing. So I think this is really where the effort should be.
Yeah, I'm going to take a question from the audience in a minute, but I just, Janis, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything on that. And before we move, I want to turn in a moment to support for Ukraine and issues related to that. But before we move on, in terms of other sanctions, just briefly, are they talking, I know it says not now, we stand ready, we need to enforce the sanctions we've got. That's what the statement from the summit has said. But are they talking, for example, about an extension of the suspension of SWIFT payments because it doesn't affect all Russian banks at the moment? Are they talking about anything else in the sanctions area at the moment? Or is it really a case of, well, we think we've hit them very hard, let's just see what happens now for a while?
No, there's a continuous discussions about sanctions, by the way, not only among Europeans, but also with the US, as we were saying earlier. There's a close cooperation. By the way, there's also a strong discussion and efforts underway to make sure that any kind of loopholes are being closed with respect to sanctions. So it's about making also sure that the sanctions which have already been adopted are adopted to the full extent. There's discussion about whether to extend those who have been put on the sanction list in terms of individuals, whether that should be extended. And so there are discussions happening with respect to also having further rounds of additional sanctions. But when it comes to and we were discussing this, when it comes to the big questions of what kind of other sanctions we need, especially with respect to energy, there we're not seeing progress. But as I said earlier, I think that progress will mostly come from pressures of things happening on the ground in Ukraine, but also of pressures coming from within the countries in terms of what needs to be done beyond what has already been decided. So this is an ongoing process.
Thank you. Fabian, quick one if you would, because I want to bring in Joanna Betson in a moment.
Sure. Just to say that I think it's important to also emphasize that it's not only about economic sanctions, it's also about the public pressure we have on companies to withdraw from Russia, even if they are not sanctioned. And we've seen that is actually rather effective. A lot of companies which initially were reluctant to withdraw from Russia have now withdrawn, and I think the air is getting thinner for those who are still there. So I think there's a clear message here that both the political leadership and populations expect companies to do the right thing, regardless of whether they fall under the sanctions or not.
Thank you. Joanna Betson, I've allowed your mic. If you can open your mic and your question or comment, please.
Thank you. My question relates to a report recently in the Politico commentary that Russia was reported as saying that it would only accept payments for its gas supplies in ruble, in Russian currency. And I was wondering, is that a serious proposition?
Fabian, can you help us with that?
I think it's at this moment in time, it isn't entirely clear what Russia is actually going to enforce in that area. There has been a direction given to Gazprom to investigate how you could do this. It's not entirely clear what that will mean. I think there's also the question of if that is really the case, what would the response be from European countries in particular who are importing this energy? I think there is a big danger here for Putin that if he pushes that kind of measure too far, that there then will be the kind of responses which we've been talking about, including, for example, putting the money into some form of escrow account rather than paying it over to Russia. So I think this is still something where, on the one hand, Putin is doing things to signal at home, but the other is that he's testing out in how far he can actually push Europeans to accept things.
Absolutely. And there's a question from Victor Jensen saying, should regime change in Russia be the unspoken objective of the EU, NATO and US at this point? Do you believe it is already the case? A simple and very reasonable call for return to the status quo ante bellum would be tantamount, says Victor, to unconditional surrender for the Russian regime. Janis.
First of all, just one addition to the question from Joanna. I think that we were taken by surprise. Nobody was expecting that Putin would come with this argument, come with this proposition, come with this threat to be paying in ruble. You could really see that this took us by surprise. The original reactions were that we were unclear what it means. And as Fabian said, we still do not know exactly what it means. But you could also see that there were fears of potentially, could this actually mean that he might revert to actually himself imposing energy sanctions on us? So there was this moment where we were taken by surprise, where you could also see that there was certain fears on our side. Since then, over the past days, I think things have changed. One is there is a strong economic argument as to whether this really would make that much of a difference, question mark. And second, we've also heard that, the Russian foreign minister, Lavrov, has now referred to ruble payments in ruble would only account for new contracts.
Okay,
not for the
we need to move
contracts.
on in a moment, very quick, because I'm
just showing that this is an example where we need to be very careful when these things come out of the Kremlin, come from Putin, and how we react to it.
absolutely
Regime
very quickly
change.
on regime change.
No, I don't think that that should be at the end of the day our objective. The question is, how can the situation develop in future, and what happens in terms of how Putin reacts to the situation that on the ground, the military operations are not working in Russia's favor. There are problems. They might be less severe than sometimes some indicate, but they are having problems. So the question is, how far will he go? And what also will Putin decide when he will have reached a certain point where you cannot progress beyond that?
Sorry, I'm going to,
Yeah, but if that point
because I want to come back to some very substantive issues that were talked about at the summit. So
yes.
I need to move us on. But Fabian, I know 30 seconds and then we must move on. Sorry to be so brutal.
I just would say that I think it would be wrong if we set that as an objective also, because clearly this would be known to Moscow as well. And that would push him more into a corner. Would make it more dangerous. We could well see desperate moves then. So I think we have to be very careful about that.
Fabian, let me stay with you just on the question. I want to come to the question of assistance to Ukraine. And before we come back, and Janis, maybe say 2 more words about the Solidarity Trust in a moment. But before we do, on the broader question of enlargement, another impassioned plea from President Zelensky last night to EU leaders doesn't seem to have made a difference. Seems that we're exactly where we were after Versailles. Indeed, Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, was saying this would turn the accession process into a political process, and that shouldn't happen. And he claimed could cause serious frustration among other countries that want to join the bloc, and could put the threaten the stability of the Western Balkans. No sign of movement yet on this. Would you expect that to stick? And are the EU leaders right or wrong to take this approach? Fabian first.
I think firstly, it is wrong to look at this in a pre-war lens, because things have changed. We now have to see our policies in a geostrategic way, and that also means our enlargement policies, not only for Ukraine, but also, for example, for the Western Balkans. Does that mean we should be allowing a country in which doesn't fulfill the conditions, which is not ready to be in? No, it doesn't. But it means that we also have to be serious about mapping out a pathway of how that can be possible, mapping out a pathway of the reforms which are necessary, not only in the country joining, but also within the European Union to make this work in future. So we do have to take it more seriously than we have before. And if we did this, we could also find a language which would be clear to the Ukrainians that we are talking about integrating them, but that it is a process which will take time, but that the final destination should not be in question. But as long as we're trying to put these kind of issues aside and not to deal with them at this moment in time, I think we're going to fail, because in the end, the war of aggression, which we're witnessing, has changed these debates, or it should change these debates fundamentally. And we need to think about this in a geostrategic way.
Thank you very much. Janis, a comment from you on that, and then could you say a little bit more about the Solidarity Trust Fund? Charles Michel claiming credit for this, saying what I seem to be slightly juvenilely. I had this idea a long time ago, not quite sure what point he was trying to make, but how would it work? Is it like an international donor conference? What is the idea?
Well, let me say some words on enlargement, because I think Fabian is right, and one needs to be clear about that. We have been thinking of enlargement in the wrong way over the past years. We thought of it as an internal function. Do we want to have new countries acceding? And are we able to have new countries acceding? We're now living in a different world. And I know one needs to be careful with making historical parallels, but in the 1990s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the fact that the European Union enlarged to that degree was because there was a strategic imperative to enlarge. It was highly political, and it was necessary to enlarge the European Union. And by the way, also at the time, countries like Poland or Hungary were for many years saying, we're always 5 years away from becoming members of the European Union. And that had already become a running joke at the time. But they knew at some point they would be joining. So it's not a matter of time. It is a matter of sending the right signal, understanding that there's a strategic imperative to enlarge, and sending the right signal to countries like Ukraine, but also to others, that the door will open. But so that it's a matter of time and not a matter of whether it will or will not happen. So when Mark Rutte says we should be careful that enlargement doesn't become a political process, for me, that's strategic myopia. It's short-sightedness. Because at the end of the day, it has become is a strategic imperative. And the question is, how do we now deal with it? And there needs to be a more open discussion, and probably also a more creative way of linking these countries to the European Union until they be able to join. But we seem, and some of us seem to be still stuck in the old thinking, which doesn't make sense now.
Okay, the Solidarity Trust Fund, how would it work? What's the idea?
Well, we don't know exactly how it would work. There's this idea that there will be an international donors conference with respect to helping the Ukraine to, once the war has ended, to recover from what has happened, that the money is there to rebuild the country, and it will be a huge effort. There will be huge efforts needed to do that. So also a huge amount of money. And the question is, where will the money come from? And that is something which you cannot now clarify because we're still in the midst of the war. It depends also how things will work out at the end. But the strong signal is we will support you when it comes to recovering from the casualties, the economic casualties, not only the human casualties, which is a tragedy in itself, obviously, but also with respect to the economic effects this war has had on you, and we will help you on that.
And was there any more discussion about military support of different types, anything like that? And also on the EU side, was there any more discussion about the refugee situation and solidarity there? I think there has been a bit of an argument about whether you spread the refugees across Europe and try to do that, or whether you send support to the countries on the borders, because the people of Ukraine don't particularly want to go very far from Ukraine because they hope to return as soon as possible. So was there discussion on either of those points at this summit? Just Janis briefly, and then I want to come on to China in a moment. And I see, our audience member also wants to talk about China. So perfect timing there. But Janis, just to complete the picture, was there much discussion of these other aspects?
Sure, there were discussions about providing further support to Ukraine, also with respect to the military dimension. And let's not forget, yesterday we also had the NATO Summit, which obviously had a lot of discussions about that, which have not become public, and they shouldn't become public. So there's a question of who provides what at what time, how far to go, what are the limits of what one can do, and member states, both of NATO, but also of the EU, indicating of what they're ready to support, how much they're ready to support. And by the way, also Zelensky asking for that support and asking it very strongly. And some countries are lagging behind. If you look of how much military support weapons have come, for example, from the Baltic countries, which are very small, to Ukraine, and you compare that to big EU member states, many of the big member states, including my mother country, Germany, are lagging behind. So there is, yes, there have been discussions, there are discussions, but a lot of that, first you don't put down on paper and you just don't discuss in public.
Okay. And on refugees, very briefly, sorry, just in terms of did they talk about it at this summit? And then Fabian, I'll come back to you and we'll talk about China.
Well, obviously they discussed the issue, but not in very thoroughly. We now have more than 10 million people who are displaced, more than 3 million who have reached the EU member states. There is support coming from the EU budget. There are thoughts about providing more support, and also if you look into the draft council conclusions, you will see that there was a reference to asking the Commission to do more because there are enormous financial burdens now in the member states which are hosting most of these refugees, and they're spreading also throughout the European Union. By the way, also a strong signal coming from the US yesterday saying that we were ready to take up 100,000 refugees. So it's not only a European issue, it goes beyond that. But this is something which will come back on the table. But it's interesting to see that those countries which have taken up now most of the refugees, especially Poland, are not that strong when it comes to pressing for EU solidarity, because they fear that we might re-engage in a debate about the solidarity dimension of migration management crisis, which we've had in the past, which they don't want to enter. So we need to be careful politically here.
Yeah, Fabian, I don't know whether you want to react to any of that, but I do want to come back on the question of China in a moment, because also our audience want to talk about it.
Yeah, on migration, I think it's important to just note it's very unlikely that we will see a reverse anytime soon. It's much more likely that the numbers will go up. And then there is a real question of how we distribute those new arrivals also across the European Union, because I think countries like Poland and other countries on the eastern frontier will reach capacity of what they can deal with. I think it's also important, just as a side remark, to just say, having heard even the US now talking about taking 100,000, it is shameful that the UK is not engaged much more into this kind of question as well. And the UK should be taking more. But on China, I think this is one of the big open questions at the moment.
Just so you know what the question from Shigeo Sugimoto is, the EU-China summit is planned for next week. And he says, if I'm correct, indeed you are, April the 1st it is. What will the EU's approach be in this geopolitical context? They did, I think EU leaders have had a discussion about this at their meetings over the last 2 days. Is it clear how they're going to approach that summit?
Well, I think at the moment there's a lot of uncertainty about how China is going to position itself, and that will also determine how the European Union reacts in the summit. I think it is very clear for the European Union that there is an expectation that China is not going to militarily support Russia, that it's not going to go all in on the Russian side. For the moment, the impression I think many people have is that China is trying to sit on the fence a bit. It's trying not to commit too strongly to Russia, but on the other hand, it doesn't want to be seen as being part of the Western response to this. So for the moment, we don't know exactly.
That raises the question then of what is the most effective tactic at a summit with China for the EU? Just to follow up, Fabian, is it to talk quite tough with China and say, you know, don't you dare militarily support Russia, or would that be counterproductive? And do they need to try? I mean, what would be the most effective strategy, do you think? Quick thought from you and from Janis. And then, Janis, I'd like to talk to you about the strategic compass as well, which was the other big issue talked about at the summit.
I don't think it very much matters what you actually say at the summit. I think the key question here is whether China understands how strong the feeling in the West is and how strong the Western alliance now is in response to this, and what the consequences would be if China chooses to disregard that. And I think here there is also a real danger for China because in the end, the war is going badly for Russia. It's not looking very convincing. And does China really want to be in a very small club of countries which are isolated internationally, which are politically seen as the pariah states? You know, if you're sitting on a very small table with Russia, with North Korea, with Syria, is that really where you want to be? So I think this is for China a very difficult moment, and it will very much depend on how also the global system develops, whether we are going to see this division into the liberal democracies on one side and the totalitarian states on the other.
But also how China views this in regard to Taiwan as well, and what the world might do if it acted on some of its threats there. Janis, a quick thought, if you would, on China, but just also to throw into the mix, because we're coming towards the end of our time. They also had a discussion, EU leaders, and endorsed the so-called strategic compass. Did they just, this is about the EU security and defense, to beef things up, were they just endorsing a document that this has been 2 years in the making, so long before the Ukrainian crisis began? Did they just endorse something that was already on the table, or has this fundamentally changed both the document and what is likely to happen as it is implemented?
One word on China. I think that what we're seeing in the debates also in China is that they haven't clearly made up the leadership of how they should position themselves. Obviously, they're looking very closely at what's happening in Ukraine, how the Russian war of aggression is progressing or not. They're obviously looking at what the global atmosphere is, and they want to wait and see until they take a position. And I think that Europeans should also put pressure on Beijing in terms of saying you need to make up your mind of how you and where you want to position yourself. By the way, the 35 countries which did not endorse in the United Nations General Assembly the position against Russia are more than half of the world's population. So it really matters what China will decide here. And I hope that they will be deciding in the right direction. With respect to the strategic compass, they endorsed it. The document, as you said, the work was on it for 2 years. but it changed massively over the past weeks. If you look into the document, you compare it to original versions, now it's full of Russia. The references to Russia, to the war of aggression in Ukraine, is now clearly embedded in the document. But for me, the question is, because we've seen a lot of documents in the past, not only, will we implement what we say in these nice documents, and it is a good and thought through document, but will we actually change our strategic culture? Will we adapt to the realities of the world as it is changing in front of our eyes? And it's not something which happens very far away from us. It is just in front of our house, of our door. And will we actually change the strategic culture of how we think about international relations, about our role in the new global order and in the new developing European security order? And that is something which is a long-term process. And I'm not sure actually whether we will have the stamina, the political will, the political endurance to go along that way, because it is a very long, it is a very difficult way. And in key countries, and Germany is a key country, almost 4 weeks ago, we heard from the German Chancellor that we are now living through a Zeitenwende, that this is a new age, a watershed moment. But you already have discussions about whether he went too far. So that just tells you that as things progress, you cannot be sure that actually we will do what we say that we will be doing. So I still have a worrying eye on that, and whether we will implement what we have written down in the strategic compass.
Okay, we're coming to an end, and there's a very interesting question from Maxime Sierro in our audience saying, regarding the strategic imperative of integration, it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, can we reasonably expect that the EU can come up with a common strategy with concrete objectives that look beyond just a few years? Can we hope, she says in a broader way, that we are in a renewed era of unity? As a final thought, Fabian, do you think that this unity, this moment, this watershed moment really can be a moment that regalvanizes the EU in other areas? Or is that unity very much and specifically linked to a reaction to what Russia has done in Ukraine, and it stops there? I suppose, does it have much wider ramifications for EU unity going forward?
I think in the end, it is a choice. It is a choice we have to make now. I think we have seen over the last 4 weeks or so that the European Union, when it comes together, can be very strong, can be very effective, can be quick, decisive. Of course, it was an extraordinary situation, and the reaction is in part explained by this. But we will now live in an extraordinary world. It's not going to be back to the kind of pre-war world we were living in. And that means we also have to look at what are our strategic objectives and how do we achieve them. And I think there is a very clear case now to say that those strategic objectives, which have to include also issues around security, issues around migration, issues around the whole range of policies we have touched on in this last hour. And that will mean that we have to find new mechanisms of working together on these. But we can fail. And if we fail, then this strong moment in European history is going to be the last, because then we will become less relevant, less effective over time. And in the end, this time around, we managed to have a decisive response to the challenge which Russia gave, not just to Ukraine, but to liberal democracy. Next time, we wouldn't, unless we find a way of working together permanently, which is more effective than what we had before.
Thank you very much. Janis, we have a couple of minutes left only.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether we will draw the strategic conclusions of this new era we live in, and then actually then also deliver on the basis of the strategic lessons should be learning. I'm not sure. Yes, we are doing things which we thought we wouldn't have been doing if you would have asked me 5 weeks ago. So we're doing things which are very different. That is also pushing the EU forward, making it a more mature actor. But what we've seen in the past, when we had severe crisis hitting the European Union, we always go as far as we have to go in order to make sure that the worst won't happen, that the situation will not spiral out of control. When we have the feeling that we have managed the situation, managed in the way that the worst has been avoided, we stop. If that is the logic, then what was asked in terms of our strategic imperative to reform and further integrate the European Union, which will require a lot of unity, we might not have the political stamina and will to push it through. I hope that this will not be the case, because I think that what this situation is showing us, that we are under severe time pressure, under pressure from the world changing and the region around us changing. We're under severe time pressure to deliver. But at the same time, I don't see that there is an appetite to actually think how to fundamentally reform the European Union, because we're saying we need to concentrate on today and not think about the longer term future. And I think this is a mistake. And the discussion we were having earlier with respect to enlargement, obviously the other side of the coin is integration, is deepening. But we're not having that discussion because we're afraid of us not being able to deliver on that. So we go as often as far as we can and not more. And I think that would be a stupidity.
And this is something, it is something that we will return to in future updates. There's lots more I would have liked to discuss with you this afternoon. I'd like to discuss the reappointment of Charles Michel, what it means, the extension of Jens Stoltenberg's mandate because of the crisis. We will come back to those things and more in future episodes of Update. Just to mention, ladies and gentlemen, they are, EU leaders are, just to bring you completely up to speed, are on a break at the moment. They are studying a new compromise text. But the quote from a spokesman for Charles Michel is, all delegations are studying it now. We are moving ahead, but it is still difficult to predict when this meeting will end. I see he doesn't say anything about whether it will end in success or failure, but we will come back to this in meetings to come. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Just to mention a few events coming up next week. I mentioned that commentary on Europe preparing for a wartime economy. Do take a look if you can. Next week, lots of events, just mention a few. One on the rule of law and the French presidency, an issue that has receded into the background, of course, since the events in Ukraine. Two events next week relating to the climate challenge, the environmental challenge. One, a policy dialogue on the plastics challenge on Tuesday, and on Thursday, one on EU-US cooperation on climate change, also on migration. So coming back to those issues, and a fascinating policy dialogue on Wednesday on women in war zones. Lots to look out for. Fabian, Janis and I will be back with another update soon, but it only remains for me now to wish you a very pleasant weekend. If you're in Brussels, the sun is still shining. It is a miracle. Let's hope it lasts for the weekend. Thank you all very much for joining us, and see you soon. Bye-bye.